Welcome to week 3 of our Start with Questions book club. I'm Karen.
I'm Sarah.
And I'm Sophie.
Special guest for the first time, week 3. Thank you so much for being here with us, Sophie. So each week we're reading a different story from our book and we're getting together to share an excerpt we were excited to talk about with each other and some connection to our teaching. This week's story is Would You Like to Stay and Code with Us this morning? And before we jump into what this story was about and who is our theorist, Sophie, I was wondering if you would be willing to do sort of a brief introduction of how were you brought into this conversation?
So I'm a current master's student at HGSE, and I will be graduating in 2 weeks, which is kind of wild to think about. I'm a master's candidate in the Teaching and Teacher Leadership program. And prior to coming to Hugsy and doing my master's, I was a 5th grade elementary school teacher. So my connection to Karen is I took her class this past semester about designing K-12 computer science learning experiences in the spring semester. And I think the reason why I'm picked to be the guest on this episode is because one of my big takeaways from that class was just how valuable it is for teachers to be students and get an understanding of what students might go through or might experience in the process of learning or going through challenges, because that was definitely something that I felt while designing my computer science learning experience. So I'm really excited to be here.
So excited to have you here. Beautiful preview for the conversation ahead. So I will turn it over to Sarah, per our custom, who will introduce the classroom we're going to be talking about today, and then the theoretical pairing for today's classroom.
So the essay we're talking about today is called Would You Like to Stay and Code with Us this morning? And it focuses on the classroom of Kara, who's a library media specialist, working with a group of first graders on coding. But this one is a little different from the other ones because it's mostly focused around the student's teacher. So Kara is the library media specialist, and then they have a classroom teacher named Diane who just kind of brings them into the space. And then Kara, the library media specialist, invites Diane to stay and code with them in the classroom and just kind of jump into the work that the students are doing. And so we hear just about what that's like for Diane. That's sort of unexpected and unusual, and she doesn't totally know what to do. And the students really warmly bring her into the space and help her engage in this work that is challenging and unexpected, and how just kind of exciting and fruitful that is. And then it's paired with a text that is sort of it's a write-up of a research project that was done by Jean Bamberger, Eleanor Duckworth, and Magdalene Lampert in 1978, where they worked with a group of classroom teachers over a 2-year period. And it's titled An Experiment in Teacher Development is the name of the text, because it was they were just we're going to do this thing that's totally different from all of the professional development that we know go on. We're going to have this incredibly intense, intimate encounter with these teachers over multiple years, where the sort of foundational idea of that learning experience was that we want teachers to learn about learning, and we want them to learn about learning by being learners, by reflecting upon themselves as learners as they reflect upon their work with students. And so the essay is sort of thinking about the ideas that came out of that really unusual teacher learning experience and how it relates to how we think about teachers as learners and their relationships to students as learners, and how thinking about themselves as learners impacts how they think about students as learners.
Where shall we begin?
I have 2 sentences that I chose. I think the first sentence is kind of what I am taking away as the main idea of the story. And it's on page 79 in the last paragraph on the page. And it says, for students to have experiences of meaningful, open-ended creation, their teachers must have the same.
Literally underline and asterisk.
Yeah,
Same.
that has been a really big takeaway of even being a master's student this year. And one of my classmates, he said it really beautifully, which is like, if like for any reason, all teachers should be required to do a master's just so that they can have the empathy of being a student again. And his like concrete example was like, all those times where my students complained to me about like not grading things quickly enough or giving really vague feedback, like now I really understand why they had those complaints. And so I think, yeah, I think there's a really interesting, I think, like tension about teacher education and how like we envision schools for kids and how there's oftentimes like misalignment. Sarah, you even brought up like professional development and professional development being sort of the experiment in the article. And I can't think about like how many or professional development sessions I've sat in that were about like play-based education or creative problem solving, where the format was like adults sitting in a room listening. And so I think there's something very like obvious, but also very important about the teacher experience mirroring the student experience.
So often in my own work, people ask me, like, what do you think is most important for teachers? So it has to start with the experience. You have to understand it viscerally. You have to reconnect to that experience of joy, play, creativity, whatever the signifier is. But if you do not understand it on that personal level, how on earth can you support it in others? That's not to say you can't step back, get more theoretical with it, have conversations about it, hear someone talk about it, but that can't just be the only way of engaging with it. And that's why I so love this work from this trio of scholars.
I think like what I think about too is like the students feel it themselves. So at the district that I work in, at the end of the year, the students do teacher evaluations, and it's anonymous. So I can't like pin who said what, but I can get like, 75% of the kids said this or 20, like stuff like that. And it was so interesting to me last year that a lot of my student evaluations were my teacher cares about me and my teacher has high expectations about me, but I'm actually like not going home and talking about the things that I'm learning. And I was thinking about that feedback and I was like, that's actually really interesting, because one of the things that I found myself saying a lot last year while teaching was, we don't have to like what we're doing sometimes, but we just got to do it. Like, and that's part of work. Like working sometimes is you do things that you don't want to do, but you just got to like grit your teeth and do it. And I was thinking about like how much of that, was me feeling that as a teacher, like having to do certain things that were not my passions or not my interests, but like we're being told to do, and how that all like trickles down. And so I think like a big case for this, why these two experiences have to mirror each other, is because like whether or not we're aware of it, they will eventually bleed into each other and just become one whole experience.
I feel like that, like, really, like, the example that you shared so foregrounds, like, it's about, like, how you think about yourself in relationship to the ideas and, like, how, like, if teachers are not given experiences to both, like, I think one of the things both of you were emphasizing was just, like, be excited about the ideas, like, how joyful and pleasurable and invigorating it is to do the kinds of work that you folks do at HGSE, where you're like designing these experiences of open-ended creation. Like, that's so joyful and beautiful, but also that it's like that you have ideas about the ideas, like you get to have ideas about the content. And I think like when the content to either teachers or students, as in the examples you were sharing, Sophie, like when the content is like done to you, like, and then you're not being invited to have ideas about it. But I think you're absolutely right that like teachers are not being invited to have ideas about the content. We're being told to deliver it, to instruct it. We're not being invited to have thoughts about it. And then that's exactly like exactly what we want for students is for them to feel like they have ideas about it, to feel like they have things to say, but that has to like start with us feeling like being invited to have ideas about the content. I love this text so much. Like one of the quotes from the Bamberger and Duckworth and Lampert on page 81 that's quoted, they say, the teachers learned both to question and trust their own experience as learners. And as a result, in their work with children, they shifted from seeking and valuing right answers to valuing the capacity to seek out ways in which what a child says or does makes sense to himself and to others. And I feel like there's so much in there that feels so important. But I like was super interested in that opening sentence where it's saying like they both question and trust their own experience, the sort of like pairing of those things that I think in some sense could seem like slightly in opposition to one another. I just wanted to throw that out there. I was really curious what like what that meant to you folks, and like how you think about what does it mean to both question and trust your own experience and perspective as a learner, for like teachers to do that, for learners to do that.
I think like what's coming up for me is my faculty advisor, Ebony. She talks about teaching being a craft. And I think like that's where you are able to question and trust. Like if you view teaching as a craft and you view teaching as like an iterative process, then you can do both. You can trust it and you can question it. And so I don't really see them in conflict with one another. I think it depends more on like what you think teaching is, and like that helps you then see how these two can actually work together. Because I think that's also part of what I gained from taking Karen's class was like, okay, I know certain things, but I also don't know everything. And so I need to, like find answers to things I don't know. I also have to make sure I'm not like being too overconfident in one area and like, so it was a computer science learning experience class. I wouldn't call myself a computer science educator or really even a computer science person in general. But I think I had to like trust that there was a value in computer science and also like question why computer science. And those two things actually came together in a really like, in a way that at first didn't seem like they would go together, but actually came together really nicely.
As you know, I was totally obsessed with your project this term, and I was wondering if you could say a little bit about what you did and a little bit about your journey, because I do think it connects in such a like profoundly beautiful way to what this like trio of scholars was engaged in with their group of teachers. Also to bring Sarah up to speed to what
No,
you were
I'd love
doing
to.
for the
I'd love
past
to hear
13
more
weeks.
about
Yeah.
it.
So like I said, I teach fifth grade. One of the fifth grade math units is about properties of quadrilaterals and the coordinate plane. And like traditionally, the way that I've taught it and the way that math curriculums teach it is like, here's a bunch of shapes and like color the red ones that are parallelograms and then circle the ones that are also squares. And it's a lot of just like, here's a definition of what a square is. Let me remember what this definition of a square is and then like apply it to a worksheet or apply it to a test question. And like somehow the way that this standard even like shows up in state testing is it will just be like a check multiple choice, and it will be like a square is also a, and check all that applies. So you're like, as a student, you just have to remember like a square is also a rectangle, which is also a parallelogram, which is also like a trapezoid. And when I was brainstorming like project ideas, I saw a way to use Scratch as a way to help kids sort of internalize these properties rather than just memorizing them. Because what I created was like a series of like coding task cards, where each task card was related to like a coding concept, so like loops or debugging, but also was tied to one of the quadrilaterals. So in coding the shape and getting the sprite to draw the shape, they were also having to remember what the properties of that shape were. So that's my project. And I think the reason why it was like a question and trust was in building the task cards and in like figuring out if these tasks were even possible. Like I had to relearn like 8th grade geometry and think about like PEMDAS and think about trigonometry and think about all these things that I hadn't thought about in a really long time, as well as like learn about Scratch. So the same sort of frustration or like intimidation that a student might feel when it comes to math or computer science or coding, like I got to in some way personally experience as well.
I was struck as you were describing just how much that's about like inviting the students to like think, like you were emphasizing that the things that felt like less valuable or like more off-putting and sort of like the prior construction of how that's taught were about like students just having to memorize these externally defined properties from other folks, and instead you're trying to give them an opportunity to like work with them and think about them and figure things out with them.
And I think like when I hear you talk about like questioning and trusting, the word that came up for me and also a word that I highlighted um in the story is bravery. There's a sentence that says bravery on the same page, actually. So page 81, bravery is required to trust in your own ideas, to be willing to pursue them without certainty regarding the outcome. And I think that was something I thought about in the design of these tasks was what I wanted to be fun was not getting the right answer. Like I think what I wanted to be fun and motivating for the kids in doing these coding challenges was like having a problem and like figuring out how to solve the problem, whether that was like by yourself or with the help of other people.
No, I'm glad you brought up the like word bravery. I remember in the Lampert and Duckworth and Bamberger, they talk about that it's destabilizing for teachers as they start to like embrace this idea that simultaneously like instead of just being focused on the right answer and instead of just being focused on right or wrong, their purpose is actually to really understand how their students are thinking about things, but that implied in that is they themselves as thinking people. And there's these descriptions of teachers. I remember especially the part that's about Eleanor Duckworth working with them on long division, that some of the teachers are like, I had ways of thinking about division and school made me feel that those ways were bad, like bad and stupid and had nothing to contribute because it wasn't standard procedures and standard algorithms. And the teachers have to do this sort of like psychological work, like for like they have to sort of like claim like I did my ideas even when they weren't like following these standard paths, those ideas had value, and I have to be able to claim that to be able to recognize the ways in which my own students, especially my students who are like thinking in more sort of divergent and atypical ways, that those ideas are valuable. I have to be able to do this work with myself to think that my ideas are valuable, to think that their ideas are valuable. And sometimes that like seeing it in the students was then also permission to like see it in themselves. But I think I'm just sort of like was very conscious as you were talking and sort of reflecting upon the situations in which teachers so often find themselves and how like I'm conscious all the time of having to do work to fend off the feeling that I'm doing everything wrong, like that I don't know anything, that because I'm not like, I don't know, following these like lockstep procedures that someone else is telling me I'm supposed to be doing, that I'm like bad and I'm like failing my students and I'm not, meeting these ideas of intellectual rigor that someone else has defined, even though I disagree with them. But I'm conscious that I'm in like so many ways in like such a privileged position and had these, as you said, like everyone should get the opportunity to have a master's. Like it's such a gift to have the opportunity to engage in research, to like read this theory. And I have the privilege of all of that. And I still feel like so bad, like I still have to do so much work to fend those feelings off. So God, like imagine how much work teachers are having to do to fend off those feelings, which are all because the structures of learning in which we ourselves are put and we ourselves are asked to replicate are not inviting us to think that we have ideas that are valuable and we have ideas to contribute, but instead that like those are things that have to be, pushed out of us. So I'm so conscious of that and wish that I had ideas about how to how to invite teachers to feel the value of their ideas as with students, that to help them learn, we have to understand how they themselves are thinking about things. We have to take very seriously how teachers themselves are thinking about things and what they are like bringing to those conversations.
Yeah. And I think like on an individual level, there's definitely something that teachers can do, but I also think there's like a bigger picture. Like in my opinion, there's sort of like two forces that are making it very hard for teachers to like feel that sense of bravery or like feel that sense of ownership. And I think the first is like there's just like in general a deprofessionalization of teaching as a career and as a practice. And I think a lot of that comes from like districts that are adopting things like scripted curriculum, or you're asking like teachers to be in lockstep. So if I'm teaching about like rain and precipitation, the classroom next to me also has to be talking about rain and precipitation, and we are like all on the same page of the same book. And I think things like that make it hard for teachers to trust their individual expertise and what they know about teaching. And I think another thing too is like so much of how we measure academic success is trying to take like learning, which is very messy as a process, but put it into like as clean cut and like cookie cutter as possible, right? So like we're gonna all take this one test and everyone's gonna like be measured by this one test. And if you don't succeed on that one measure, instead of like, okay, let's try something new, then I think usually like I think about like turnaround schools, right? Like if you're a school that's not achieving academically, a lot of times what happens is they'll take away the people who are working at that school and put new people and tell those new people exactly what they're supposed to be doing. And so it's almost like as like a system in general, we don't have this like trust, and maybe it's like a big fear of trying something new. And so we're just going to stick to things that we think we know and just keep doing them over and over again. And hopefully the third time it'll work or the fourth time it'll work. But yeah, I think there's a big fear of just like flexibility and allowing things to look and be different.
What gives each of you hope? What sustains you, given these very real challenges that all teachers face?
I think a big hope for me, and also part of what I feel very grateful for in terms of like taking a year off from teaching, is just like meeting other people who feel similarly and meeting other people who are like dedicating their time and their effort to either make these changes like on a like a smaller scale, not smaller in impact, just like smaller in terms of like the environment, right? Like in like a one-on-one interaction, and also like people who are like doing policy level things or like district level changes. So I think just like knowing that I'm not the only person who believes in this and wants things to be different is like hugely um, motivating and inspiring.
I was thinking, Sophie, as you were talking, the story that we at some point had talked about doing, I'm not sure we're going to do it on this one, of like, which is Carl Weick, the theorist, is paired with a story. And one of the things that Carl Weick talks about in his like organizational psychology is this idea that sort of like these things have been thrown at schools as like failings, that teachers are doing things in slightly different ways, that there is sort of like some autonomy within classrooms. And part of his argument is like those things are actually strengths, they're not failings, and that the work, like what you were saying, the sort of work of learning, which is complex and involves uncertainty, demands organizational structures that have the space for that kind of flexibility and autonomy and responsiveness to the individual situation. And I think sort of like part of what I take away from that is that like I feel like structures are trying to pound that out of schools, but you kind of can't. Like there's something you can't. And I think part of it is because as teachers, like you fundamentally spend the whole day with these like beautiful young people in front of you. And so what you are doing is responding to them and to their needs. And I feel like what I end up saying like to colleagues all the time is like, they'll like say this story of like, oh man, like I wasn't doing the lesson exactly as I was supposed to be doing it. And I like did this deviation and I was just like, because you were responding to the needs of the people in front of you. Like, that's what you were doing because that's what good teaching is, because you had this sense about whether it was about the individual and what they needed was about how they were like interacting with the content. And like, I'm just trying to like in that interaction of like to validate, to give permission that is like a legitimate and valuable professional move and choice. But I think that there's something about the nature of the work and I feel like I'm always so elementary, but I'm sure it's true of like upper folks as well. Just like, these are who you're with all day. This is who the work is between you and them. And even though I wish so deeply that these structures that surround us were more engaged with thinking about teacher learning the ways that I know that Karen is at HGSE, the ways that the theorists in this text are, there's something about when you're just doing the work that invites these ways of thinking that are about being responsive to individual needs, that are about just like, this is who you're thinking about. And so I think that there's those things sustain even when they're trying to be pounded out of us. We can't help it.
I think what Sarah said really just reminded me that like the kids themselves are also a source of hope. And I think that's like part of what I got from the story too, right? Like when Diane first walked in and like didn't know where to begin and where to start. It was actually like the student who reached out and noticed and brought her and was like, here's the app and here's how you begin. And I think like thinking about imagination and I can go on a whole nother tangent about imagination, but like I think like one of the big tensions I felt as a teacher is like here I was like working with these people, like these young people who imagination came so naturally to and would say things that like so matter of factly about how they wanted the world to be. And then like in the back of my head, I was like, oh, well, that's not going to actually work out. Or like, you have to think about bills or you have to think about like what the law is and like all these like constraints. And I think what is very like what remains something like hopeful for me is I think for the most part, adults work from a like, okay, here are all the problems and how can I operate within the problems? But then I think a lot of children operate with like, here's all the possibilities and which one do I want to like follow and go down the path of. So I really appreciate you like reminding us, Sarah, that the students themselves are like the big source of hope.
Sophie, are you going back to your same classroom position?
Yes.
How do you think it will be to do that?
I think I'm very lucky thinking about bravery that I'm going back to an environment that I know very well and a school culture that I know very well and a community that I know very well. So like I think I'm positioned like in a way where I have this like momentum from grad school to like be ready to try some new things and also like I'm in an environment where I don't have to like meet people for the first time or like understand what the climate and culture is like for the first time. And so that puts me, I think, in a pretty unique position to try new things. There was like a phrase that I learned recently, like safe to fail experiments. And like, that's really what I'm thinking about is like, okay, if I try this, the worst case is actually not that bad. So I'm going to like, what's the harm in trying? So I think I'm really excited about that part of going back.
I will say I like having gone back to classroom teaching after like time at HGSE, it's harder. I can't bring myself to do stuff that I really don't believe in, but I'm grateful for that. Like, even if maybe sometimes it seems like a problem, I'm mostly just grateful that, and it's also mostly okay. And like, I think I'm broadly in like a supportive, caring environment, but it's not, it's sort of like perfect or like anything, but I can't bring myself to do things that really go against like these beliefs that you have about what is right for students and what is right for you. But it's really mostly fun.
I think a big part of this is also well-being. I think there needs to be like a huge movement in like teacher well-being, like prioritizing sleep and prioritizing nutrition and prioritizing movement, like sort of like basic survival needs that I think a lot of times like, oh, that's just how teaching is. Like, oh, I'm supposed to work long hours. I'm supposed to like give up my weekends to be grading. And there's like a voice that's in me that's like, well, if we want these kids to have balanced lives, then like we should have balanced lives too. And so I think this like symmetry between like teacher experience and student experience goes beyond just like what the classroom is like. I think it's also goes into like lifestyle and aspiration and a lot more like less tangible, I think, outcomes.
It's incredibly hard to take care of others if you are not taking care of yourself. It's the airplane oxygen mask situation, right?
Yeah.
It is hard to operate in the space of possibility and not just the space of problems if you cannot be your full self, physically, emotionally, mentally, intellectually.
Karen, do you have like other things that felt important to you about this one that you wanted to note or highlight?
Well, I love the ending of the story. As she gets up from the table, Diane declares, "That was the best thing I ever made in my whole life." One of my priorities in the types of learning experiences that I design is I so desperately want every single learner to have a moment like that. It doesn't, it doesn't have to be the greatest thing they've ever made in their entire life, but just that sense of joy and exhilaration of I'm doing something I care about, I have made something of consequence to me and possibly to others in a really lovely way. I do want it to be something that students come to class, have good experiences, and then they feel compelled to tell someone else about it. I want learners to go home and like tell a partner, tell their child, tell their parent, like, look at this crazy thing I'm working on and I'm excited about it. And I want to share that excitement with you. So I love the ending of that story. I think that's it for week 3 of the Start with Questions book club. Sophie, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your beautiful ideas about teaching. And it was truly a joy to learn with you and from you this term at HGSE. And I can't wait to see what you do in your classroom next year. Yeah. Cheering you on, as always.
That's the hard part. It's easy to talk about it. Now we have to do it. So that's the hard part.
You're going to do great.